I am Abdellah Sabry, CX engineer based in Lisbon, and today we're going to discuss NSO NED migrations. I have an agenda here. We'll start by a small, brief history with common data models. We'll pass on to NED versioning and NED migrations. We'll see some scenarios and issues that we might face in NED migration, and then there is a proposition of a tool called the NED Migration Utility that helps with all the process. So yeah, common data models. Actually, I tried to make an analogy with something. And since we are in Sweden, and I searched Google common things, well-known things, and what caught my eye is the wildlife and the fermented fish. So I'll go with the wildlife analogy. As you can see, as you all know, we have a very diverse wildlife in Sweden. There are a lot of species of deer. There is elks, there are reindeer, there is the moose. So all of these species have subspecies. There is the white elk, and there's a special red deer. And all of these, let's imagine if we want to model them and differentiate between them, we need to have a different, let's say a common model and slight differences in the model. And we can imagine that we have a model called deer, and then we can imagine afterwards, after a while, after the scientists discovered that these are different species, they thought about, okay, maybe we should have a different model for this one and another model for this one. And going back to the network, of course, this is where the common data models got introduced in NSO 5. So historically, in pre-NSO 5, we could load only one version of a Yang model. And that translated to all the models, but specifically to the NEDs, we could see the impact. Since we can have different type of devices, we can imagine the big species like Huawei, Nokia, Juniper, and other vendors, and we have subspecies, which is the version of the NED. So for example, Nokia, we have release 16, release 21, and some things are backward incompatible, and we need to have a very different model to handle that. And we take it for granted for now, but before it was much difficult to handle all these cases. And the cool thing now about NSO, we have the common data models, which gives us the possibility to have different versions of the model. So in post-NSO 5, we have a new namespace identifier, which is, again, the XML namespace plus something called the mount ID. And we can see here this new namespace identifier. It's called crunched namespace. And where does this mount ID comes from? There is a special RFC that was introduced in 2019, RFC 8528, about Yang schema mount. And this RFC introduced this concept of mounting a Yang model in another, a schema in another model. So, and there is this new concept of the mount ID. In NSO specifically, we can imagine that there is the namespace, but the namespace, if it's iOS, we can have different NEDs, and they all have the same namespace. So we have to differentiate with something else. And in this case, it's the NED ID, which is unique specifically for NSO, and according to documentation, the mount ID in the standard is NED ID in NSO. I don't think you can hear me anymore. Yeah, of course. Yes, better. So, of course, this translates to all the models in NSO, but now we're more interested in NED versioning. NED versions. So if we want to understand all of this, we need to understand the versioning schema in the NEDs. As all the software versioning systems, we have a major version. In this case, it's 5. Minor version, which is 8. Third number is usually the maintenance version, and if you have a fourth number, it's a patch. And as you can see here, there's a special RFC. There's an RFC for everything, of course. There's a special RFC here about compliant model update. And this RFC describes when can we actually, where are we compatible to upgrade, and where we have to do something special to change from a model to another model. As you can see, between patch versions, we don't have any issues, or maintenance versions. But if we change minor version in the NED, we have to NED migrate. And this is our topic today. Okay, so what's a NED migration? If you want to define it, it's an action, a normal action. And it's a tool to migrate between backward incompatible NED versions. In this case, if we have different minor version we want to upgrade to, that would be the case. The action migrates all configuration and service to metadata, and we will see that afterwards. So as a side effect, the action reads and writes, but what does it read and what does it write? So you can imagine that we want to migrate the model, right? And we need to read the configuration. And we can, generally we read it from the device, okay? So there is a, let's say, a show running config of the device that reads all this information and render it through this new model, which is the new NED version. And then, of course, when it renders, it needs to write. So where does it write? It writes in the CDB and not on the device. Because logically, this is an update in modeling and not an update in configuration. So nothing is touched on the device in any NED migration. And that makes it safe to run NED migrations in operational hours. But it's better to do maintenance windows. Maybe, as we all know, weird things happen. And of course, if you have the possibility to do a CDB backup, that would be a good thing before starting all this process. So if you opt for the no networking option, you actually just read from the CDB and write in the CDB. So there would be no issue at all. And it's good for testing, actually. So how can we imagine this NED migration process? So what's the first thing? Of course, we need to download the new NED, install it and everything. We all know that. That's the first step. And the second step, where it becomes interesting. We all see and hear about people just executing NED migrations without any option. I have a new version of the NED. I opened the attack case. I had an issue. I had an issue with the command. And now I will just migrate my devices. And that would create a lot of problems. Actually, we have to check the difference. And there are a lot of ways, depending on over what do you prefer. But I prefer migrate dry run. And this migrate dry run, we will see it later, it gives all the paths. And but you can explore the changes file. It's always good to explore the changes file, compare both files between the versions, and you can have more description and you can understand what's happening in between versions. So if you have this information, for example, if it's something touched your service, you can update your service, and that would include YANG model if you have references, template, if you call something or you reference the NED YANG in the service through the make file and then import in the NED, that would be something that you have to update. So once we updated the service, we will see it should be done in a certain way, and we can run the NED migration in a certain way, of course, and if we need, we have to redeploy, sometimes reconcile. And that's depending, for example, if all the configurations that you need are actually deleted. They don't exist anymore, they moved to somewhere else, and you actually need to regenerate the new NEDs and, of course, the new templates. Of course, you need to redeploy to have that part of the configuration on your service, owned by your service, because it would be changed automatically by the NED action, but it should be on. And at the end of the day, you can delete the old NED package, but that would be happening after a long while, because you can imagine that's a good thing about NED migrations. You can have different devices with different versions of NEDs, and you can still have your old NED for a while, let's say a month, while you're migrating the devices one by one. And you can also have the old NED in the same, you can have your service supporting both NEDs if you want. So I have a code here because in the slides they highly advise that. So do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. That was said by Marcus Aurelius, the great Marcus Aurelius. And why am I mentioning this here? Because if you have to be very careful with NED migrations. You have to be, if you do a NED migration, it's like you're doing the last one, and you have to be sure, because imagine if you worked your, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months over your services, and you have thousands of instances, and you just migrate your devices to a new NED blindly, and you could lose the service metadata and ref count and backpointers to all your services, and that's not something that you want, hopefully. And there's another quote I didn't put here: with great power comes great responsibility, and that's said by Spider-Man's uncle. So with great power comes great responsibility, and we have to do responsible about NED migration. So I have a lot of topics here. I will run through them quickly. So these are just concepts that we have to be aware of while working in NED migrations. So first thing, dry run verbose, which is something that everyone should do. I think we shouldn't have the option to not do verbose. We always should do verbose. Why? Because, for example, here I have a setup with an NSO 5.7 and the Cisco iOS CLI from 6.77, and I want to upgrade to 6.79, which is a minor version upgrade. And I can see here when I do dry run, which means just simulate, and verbose gives me the modified paths and with the information, and at the end, a very interesting line, which is affected services, which is the instances that are affected by this NED migration, if I execute it, of course. Knowing this concept of NED affected services, here, for example, I have a service called simple service, and there is a part of the configuration here in the simple service which was affected by the NED migration between those versions. And you can see here that, let's say, these nodes changed from empty leaf to leaf. And as you can see here, my model still uses the empty leaf. Then if I migrate, I'll impact my service. So here you can see this action smartly shows me which service is affected, and I have even the instance. I will just talk about the out-of-sync devices and no networking options. By default, as I said, if you run the NED migration, you pipe details or you check the progress trace or devil log, you can see here that there is a show, NED show, and reading config, okay. So I'm connecting to the device and reading from it. If that's not a problem for you, okay, it's good. But if you want to work with the no networking options for whatever reason, you can have the no networking flag. And that flag, as you can see here when I run it, I don't have the reading phase from the device. And that can be useful maybe in testing. Maybe if you manage your devices out of sync, you don't want to connect to them. You don't want to really show running config, the device configuration is too big. You manage in your devices in an out of sync fashion. You commit no override. You can have all of these options. Technically, you can just go by no networking, and when you have a commit no override, there is the partial sync from, and that partial sync from will render that part of the configuration that wasn't rendered before, and it will match the model, the new model. This is very useful if NED ID and very problematic. And why is it useful? Because you can have a service with different versions, different templates from different NED versions. And that's pretty common. You can have a certain part of the configuration that is not supported anymore, and you'd have to manage your NED IDs. But it can be also problematic in a lot of, what I mean by that, for example, here I have an if NED ID, and I said 677, and I migrated to 679. And let's say afterwards I want to redeploy my service, and I did it by mistake blindly. I'm checking God's modification, and I have nothing. my service is deleted, actually. Not deleted, but it's not owned by this instance. It's rendered, but there is no bug pointer, no anything. So I cannot work on this service. And imagine if the device has a lot of services, it's a big router, I lose every instance there if they go by this template. And as you can see here, because the condition is not met anymore, if I redeploy, I'll lose everything. So we have to be very, very careful with if NED ID. And how to do that, actually, we can create a new template with a new model, add another if NED ID, that's an option. If there is no issues, no need for NED ID, of course, that would be great. If you have, for example, if you finished the NED migration, your service has the option to work with both both versions, and you have if NED ID, and you delete the old NED, NSO won't even start if you restart NSO. And if it was starting and you do packages reload, you'll face issues. Yang references, well, this is very logical, because if I'm referencing the model of the NED, the old NED, and I have something in my Yang of the service that references something here that actually changed in between versions, that's problematic at so many levels. Of course, I can't make clean all, I can't compile my file, because this one would be problematic. Or it can still be there if I didn't delete the old NED, but still here, if my device is migrating and the service references this would be problematic. So we have to be careful with the Yang references and update them along with the service template. Locked devices. So this is just a possibility, of course. If you try to run NED migration and you have some locked devices for whatever reason, southbound locked or locked, you actually faced errors. A device is locked, device southbound locked. And what you can do actually, just to, if you have to, operational-wise, if you have to migrate your devices to that NED, you can do it in no networking. It works, but you have to unlock the device, maybe sync from later on. But it's just an option. Redeploying services. So there is this cool paragraph in README in an example of in the documentation. So it is important to redeploy all affected services touching the device after the device migration, even though there are no backward compatibilities, because there's the diff set that has the reference of the old NED, and that creates issues. So we have to redeploy to update the reverse diff set. But in starting, there is an engineering release at 23.172 that says NSO does no longer require all affected services to be redeployed. That's post, I think, NSO 5.4. But that doesn't mean you don't have to redeploy your services at all. So this is when you don't have any changes in your service, and maybe only the diff set that has that information linked to the old NED. But of course, we need to redeploy our services if the template is very, very different. So here I gathered a common configuration that didn't change, and some configuration like reduce server. This one changed between those two versions. And I have a service called simple service that configures this. Okay, so I have my git forward diff set that shows me this. And of course, I have my service metadata back pointer to the service, ref count 1, all good. And if I run the NED migration, I can see here that these paths are touched. Okay, the node has changed from empty leaf to leaf. And if I check again my service metadata, I will find that I lost all my metadata references to my services. Basically, my service is useless regarding this, and I have to do extra work. And that would be, for example, here, adding another if NED ID, because if I have the same template, that would create confusion between two NEDs. So I'm differentiating between them here with if NED ID. And as you can see here, this is a leaf, not an empty leaf. And if I add this part of the configuration and redeploy dry run, you can see there is nothing to update because the configuration already was migrated by the NED, but it's not owned. So what happens here, I own let's say I have ref count 2, I have a byte pointer to that part of the configuration, but I don't own it because it's like I synced from the device. There was a byte pointer 1, redeployed, byte pointer 2, refcount 2. And yes, at this stage, I have to reconcile. And if I do reconcile, I have my service reconciled, and I can modify it, work with it, and follow the life cycle of the service. That was all about redeploying services. Quick things about change files. You can go and compare the files, read important information from here, for example. I have the information about this radius service change between these two versions. So I take the change file between the two versions of the NED, and I just compare them. Upgrades, quickly about NSO upgrades and NED migrations. There are two schools of thoughts, and if it's possible, of course, you can recompile packages in the target version, go to upgrading NSO and migrate. Or NED migrate first if you have the versions available in both versions of the NSO, migrate first and upgrade the NSO. And this is actually case by case. Sometimes you don't have versions between compatible versions. You can go by recompiling. If it works, it's fine, no issues. But if you have some issues, you might ask, you might open a case, and ask the BU if there is support, of course, to create a NED, specific NED for you that is supported between the versions. If that is not possible, you can go through another NSO version that supports both and then migrate. It's like a two-steps migration. Of course, each person does this in a different way, but these are two main school of thoughts. LSA, one last thing. So an RFS node is a device to the CFS node. And post NSO 5.4, we have this new NED ID, Cisco NSO, netconf XY. This depends on the version of the RFS. And we can talk a lot about this, but bear in mind, if you want to move, if you had LSA netconf before 5.4 and you want to upgrade and you want to move to something like this, you have to do a NED migration. It's an RFS device. An RFS service is a device, and you have to migrate, and have to be very careful about this. Yeah, one last thing is the NED Migration Utility. As we noticed, there are a lot of issues, a lot of cases, a lot of things to take in consideration. So we propose this, let's call it utility script anything, that executes. Imagine we have 100 devices. We had some problems with the NED. We have to upgrade 200 devices, 300 devices. And to look all these cases and take all of this in consideration is very heavy. So we need something that automates this, gives me the good cases, shows me the bad cases. And this is what the NED Migration Utility does. So I can execute in NED batch fashion. I have some pre-checks. And executes the safe migration if I want. And it improves visibility, generates some reports, so you can record the information, you can have some reports. There are some logs. It checks if the devices are onboarded, because you can give a list, the device is not onboarded, it gives an error, checks if the NED package is well loaded, status is up, check if the device is already migrated, otherwise it would give an error, check if the device is locked, that would give an error too. You can go on it's working. Capability executes NED migration of a group devices in a driver verbose mode. So always we have driver verbose mode, and shows the modified paths in their info, as we saw in one execution, but it stores them in a report, and we have the logs. Gives the possibility to handle the affected services if there are any in a separate. You can skip them if you want, or separate them case by case. Loops over the list of the provided devices and records every step. Yeah, we will do a small demo here. I recorded this yesterday, and I have here on the top, as you can see, this is my editor. So I have my directory here, and I have this Python code, NED migration.py, and it has a nice helper. So I put .-help. I have all what it does, how to use it, every flag, everything. So what can I do is, yeah, I'm just copying here, not to make a mistake in the demo. And as you can see here, I have NED migration.py, new NED ID. I have to provide the new NED ID, 679, and I have to provide a file with a list of devices I have to migrate. So here I can see I have some devices, one of them not onboarded. This device doesn't even exist. Added them there. And also it generates reports. So there is a log I can open in parallel. I'm opening there with tail-f, and I'll execute. So at the beginning, says, would you like to continue? Here's what it will do. So I have here device migration script starting, reading devices list, devices onboarded, loaded, target NED, running migration in dry run mode. So as you can see here, I have an affected services, I have changed paths, and it says, would you like to continue and migrate this device or not? And I can say either yes or no. If I manage my case, I can say yes or no. In this case, maybe I didn't update yet my service. I'll say no, just move to the next device. And now, as you can see, there is a status bar at the end. We can see number of devices. This is 12%. And I'm running the NED migrations automatically. And it checks, of course, all these cases that we're talking about. So it executes the safe migrations. There are no affected services. There's nothing touched. It migrates. There's an issue. It stops and shows you the issue. Of course, you can see there was some lines in red. If there is a deleted path, it just lines up in red and writes it in the report. So you can keep that information because that's the most obvious one that you have to update in your service. We're down to 50%. For example, this device is not onboarded, skipped. Doesn't stop the process. Here, for example, this device, maybe this case is something that I managed. There are no issues with the templates. Yeah, I just want to NED migrate. I take the responsibility. So I say yes. And yeah, move on to the, I think we are the last device here. Yep, we have the dry run first, and then the execution, final execution after. That's it. And as you can see here, all the paths and information, and the checks that we saw before in the information. For example, the flags, dry run false, no networking false, if I want to do no networking. And yeah, all the information about the execution. As you can see here, there is, for example, this path has been deleted. I can take it in consideration. So as we saw, there are some reports and some log files like this one on the right. We can open it in a beautiful Visual Studio editor, and we can see every step that is recorded. There is something critical, informational, warnings, every option, and every path updated. If there are affected services, they're also logged here. And I have the JSON report. You can integrate it if you have a northbound system to have this information, JSON, with all the options and the results and the modified paths, if there are any affected services. Yeah, thank you. So, if there are any questions, yes.
Test. Okay. You mentioned that if an NED, if you have a different version but you recompile it and it works, it should be fine. But my question is that, let's say, Cisco's official position, so if I do it and it works, so...
If you have some nice friends, it works. But exactly, so the official way, you should have an official NED. But sometimes, depending on the time constraints, you might recompile and take that risk. Because if you recompile in a different version that is not supported by DBU, you might not have the support.
Right, but my question is exactly that. So as a customer, is that a recommended path, or...
It's better to communicate open attack case, proactive case, and ask the BU's feedback. It's better.
But if I do it, do I get support or do I lose support?
Well, I'm not good with contracts. So as you can see, I'm an engineer, so I don't know really what happened case by case. So
okay, so
Yeah.
another question that I also had in terms of restrictions. So if I have, you had like some NED IDs, right?
Yeah.
Is there a restriction to how many NED IDs I can have for a particular NED in one NSO? Like, can I have like, 10 Cisco XR versions in the same?
I'm not aware of any restrictions. Maybe somebody knows, but I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of that.
And in terms of migration, can I jump from a very low version to a high version, or is that like a gap, like a range?
If you are in a, basically you're always in a minor version upgrade. So if you are in a patch or maintenance, you probably don't need a NED migration. If you want to do it, that's fine. But if you are two versions between, like, for example, 620 and 670, you actually have to do NED migration. If you find, mostly it will work. That's how the design is. If it doesn't work, you can open a case about that. Maybe there's a specific case because the NED migration is just introduced in 5, NSO 5, and it improves. Actually, in NSO 5.6, it's improved a lot in performance. There's a lot of updates, like affected services with changes, which was a differently for us, different context. It got deleted in 5.6, so it grows. And if you have issues, normally it should work between minor versions. And if you have issues, of course, you can open a case regarding that.
Okay, so I guess the path is open as Cisco TAC case.
Yeah,
that's my understanding.
Of course, the TAC handles that, and it is the BU behind. So we have all our experts.
Okay.
All right, I think we need to move on. So
if you have any questions,
thank you a lot, Abdellah. That's great.